Namaste and welcome to the Festival of Bharat. My name is Vaibhavi Naik and I will be your host for today. On behalf of the Festival of Bharat team, I would like to wish all of our viewers and our supporters our best wishes on the occasion of Independence Day. To help us commemorate the departure of the British, we are joined by our very own Pandit Satish K. Sharma. Namaste, Panditji.
Namaste ji, Pranam ji, Jai Shri Ram, and it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation today. Thank you.
Now, since today, the Independence Day, it would be the best time to talk about one of the most significant events about the history in the history of Bharat, which is the partition, which is a term that was coined by our colonizers, and the narrative, the premise is presented by the colonizers as they left about this event was that it was a devastating, heartbreaking event, of course, which it was. But there's only one side that is presented. There's only one community which is said to be the victims of that event. And this, what is called as a partition, would be actually, it would make sense to call it a dismemberment, something even a targeted genocide. And it has been misrepresented as communal riots between these two groups. But we are now beginning to know that there is more to this story. So, Panditji, what is the real story of the partition?
Vaibhavji, if I can join you in expressing my best wishes also to the Festival of Bharat viewers and supporters, and to thank them for the support and for helping the channel get to where it is. Um, it has enabled us and empowered us to now start to talk about many of these uncomfortable issues, and has given most of our teams the confidence to even openly speak in a manner which I think the Hindu community has not been able to speak for a long period of time. One, we don't like to cause offense. We always try and find a win-win situation. Secondly, we're not actually people who will use language in a violent manner. And so sometimes telling a person the manner in which they are harming you feels a little bit like an act of violence. But we have slowly gotten to that stage where our healing is now, it's informing us, and we're able to start to talk about these things from a position of pure satya. And when we look at it through the lens of satya, a whole different panorama opens up in front of us. You're absolutely right. Dismemberment is a very gentle way of, of of describing the horrific slash and run um, strategy that was unleashed upon the Hindu civilization, the traditional indigenous civilization at that time. You mentioned partition in quotes, and that I think is a great place to start, because language is so important, and the manner in which this story has been conducted, the very specific words which have been used to weave this story, they really need to be revisited. Remember, Ravan, we're taught that Ravan was Mayavi. He was able to use words to weave illusions. And sometimes I think London is the Lanka of the 20th and 21st century. They were masterful in weaving illusions with words. Chief Sitting Bull over in the Americas once made an expression. He said, he coined the phrase, white man speaks with forked tongue. That, they will say one thing and mean another thing. And when you look at the vocabulary that's used to describe the events of the 15th of August 1947 and the weeks and months leading up to it, you can see that forked tongue at play. So you've described partition. And the conventional story is that the British came to Bharat. It was an uncivilized, savage nation. Terrible, terrible people, demonic practices. Their deities were devilish. They practiced the most horrific social and cultural discriminations. And the white Christian Anglicans came and descended upon us, bringing their white savior skill set and their toolkit. And they tried to do the best to make us into proper human beings. Remember that at that time, personhood was not granted to people who were non-white, non-Christian. They were deemed to be members of the animal kingdom, part of fauna and flora. Persona non grata means that the status of personhood hasn't been granted. And so this is the perspective that they like to say, that they came and they civilized us. And it cost us $45 million, but that's another story. And it cost us over 100 million lives lost to the nation civilization. But the story is that they came for our benefit, civilized us. And then it got to a particular point where they felt that their job of making us into human beings was done, that they wanted to leave. I was reading some of the records and the letters and the correspondence of that time, and Churchill, Elphinstone, the other lords who were creating this partition, this exit strategy, shall we say, they emphasized that the new government in India must accept to be part of the Commonwealth. Okay? Because if Bharat had said, we don't want to be part of anything to do with you people, you are violent, nasty people, right? We are free that you're gone and we don't want to be a member of your club of any other ex-slaved colonies, then it would have been a different story. But Nehru was impressed, it was impressed upon him that Bharat must become part of a Commonwealth, because that then allowed the British to maintain the moral high ground. They had colonized the moral high ground before they colonized the actual physical ground of many nations. And that would allow them to maintain that moral high ground. And so what actually happened was they got to that point and wove the story that these savages, there are these Hindu savages, and there are these wonderful peace-loving Muslim minority. And the Hindus will descend upon them and wreak havoc to such a degree that in order to save lives, the humanitarian thing that we have to do is create a new nation, a safe nation. Now, anybody who's a student of history will know that there is a myth. In fact, there have been books written about the myth of Christian persecution, how it was such an effective strategy where they would inflict violence and then claim to be the persecuted themselves. It's a strategy. And Goebbels himself, Hitler's master of propaganda, he also said, accuse the others of your own guilty actions as part of strategy. And so they created this idea that the Hindus were a terrible people who were going to do this mass genocide. And then what they actually did was an act of unspeakable, horrific violence, which even to this date, most Hindus have not understood it for what it was. So just imagine, we had wave after wave of enslavers who came across the Khyber Pass and the northwest frontier. And their intention was to steal, was to rob, was to kill, and to inflict genocide. This was their intention, and they did it as a service to their God, as had been told to them to do and justified to them to do by their clerics. And these are the people who'd been attacking the Bharatiya civilization for over a millennia. They'd wanted the lands, we had fought back. They'd wanted the assets, civilizational assets and the wealth, we had fought back. And what the British did when they left is they actually handed that civilization, that identity, that ideology, which had been wreaking havoc upon us, the British gave to them the lands that we had been defending for a millennia. They gifted the Indus Valley, the Saraswati Valley civilization, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, all of these. That's where our civilization was born. Those are the roots, the river civilization. And the British gifted what we had been fighting for and just handed it over to this ideology, which at its roots says that we do not have the right to exist because we are kufr. They gave that over. In the process, a huge swathe of Hindus who lived and whose civilizational assets mounted to billions of dollars worth of just pure raw wealth and land, they just handed it over and deprived the Hindus of home and hearth, their ancestral lands, and arranged for them to leave those lands. It was ethnic cleansing. Right? It was, remember, in the Hindu side, on the Hindu side, there was no requirement that the Muslims should leave Bharat. Okay? And yet on the other side, there was a necessity for the Hindus to leave because Pak means pure, purified. It was a land which was going to be purified of infidels. And so the British created what I call killing fields. They created the killing fields where Hindus were massacred in their millions, tens of millions. And that has not yet been fully accounted for. This is what they did. And Hitler, I remember reading one of his letters. Lord Mountbatten had a meeting with Hitler, with Churchill. I'm sorry, these terrorists, they're much of a muchness. Lord Mountbatten had a meeting with Churchill before he left for India. And in that meeting, Mountbatten started to speak about his strategy, and Churchill interrupted him, and he said, and this is recorded, he said, "I don't care what you do, so long as not a single head, so long as not a single hair on the head of a single Muslim be harmed." Okay, that was Churchill's instruction to Lord Mountbatten, and it's probably worth our viewers knowing that in the British military services, Mountbatten was called the Master of Disaster. That was his title. His unofficial title was Lord Mountbatten is the Master of Disaster. And so they sent the Master of Disaster to implement the ethnic cleansing of Hindus from their ancestral homeland, which is now called Pakistan. The bifurcation was done on that border by a person, Radcliffe, who had never been to Bharat. And if you have a look at the degree of mischief in how that line was drawn, Nankana Sahib, the Gurdwara, which is associated with Guru Nanak's birth, they deliberately drew a line to keep that in Pakistan and separate it from the Sikh community in Punjab. It was an act of mischief and violence repeated again and again and again. So the partition should not be called partition because partition implies an equality on both sides of what is being separated. The intention is to have some sort of equitable partition, and that's not what was done. What was done, as you rightly said, was a dismemberment. It was a civilizational slash and run, and it was done in a manner which was intended to harm as many Hindus as possible in the process, but to leave an environment where Hindus would continue to be harmed after the British had withdrawn. And the evidence is visible. The evidence is visible in the fact that there were 23% of the Pakistani population were Hindus in 47, and now they're down to less than 1%. And yet, the Times newspaper in the United Kingdom yesterday published an article which says that Modi has created an environment in which the Muslims in India are now vulnerable and are attacked. Okay? No mention of what's happened to the Hindus of Pakistan. No mention of the 45 million Hindus who have disappeared from the population in Bangladesh. No mention of Direct Action Day. No mention of the reality of what was inflicted upon Bharat. So when I look at 1947, there is a relief from one point of view in that at least the physical presence of our slave masters, right? Colonialism is another one of those fancy words, when really what was done was the indigenous population were enslaved and their ancestral resources were stolen and squirreled away and brought back into Europe. It was done by the British, it was done by the Dutch, it was done by the French, etc., etc. But the British were the ones who did this with an efficiency which is perhaps only ever seen by a person who performs autopsies. You know, it was such a violent act that was inflicted. And so I'm torn between a sense of relief that at least the physical presence, that stopped. But the manner in which they left affairs afterwards was equally cunning. What they did is they left, the Indian National Congress Party was actually the seed, it was a Trojan horse. In the same way that the Greeks left the gift of a Trojan horse and then went and everybody thought that they had disappeared and the battle was over. The Indian National Congress was in fact a Trojan horse. And if you have a look at the manner in which the current leadership of the National Congress have conducted themselves for 70 years, you can see that their decisions were actually a continuation of anti-Hindu policies that were bequeathed to them by a departing anti-Hindu Christian enslavement civilization. They were enslavers. And it's been continuing until the current government came into power. So there's a bit of celebration in that at least we had the opportunity to try and stand up. It took another 50 plus years before we actually managed to get leadership in place who were in tune and in harmony with the civilizational vibration of the Bharatiya people. And this is something that the colonialist enslaving powers finding it very, very difficult to stomach. Remember, we're talking about Christianity and Islam, the religions of the book. Their history, sadly, is that minorities have not prospered in areas where they control the state. Pakistan's Hindus we've spoken about. Saudi, once upon a time, had a very thriving non-Muslim population. Its history was in that manner. And yet, the state does not give equality to Hindus in any of the Middle Eastern countries, with the exception possibly of Israel. And so what we were left with was the hard work of overcoming the best part of 1,200 years of trauma with 200 years of unbelievable, unspeakable genocidal, ethnocidal activities by the British. And we then had the opportunity to say, right, now at least we have a breathing space. And so this thing called partition, it's not finished business yet. At the moment, the game is still underway. The strategy that was implemented in 47 is still being acted upon and largely not noticed by the majority of our Bharatiya community. The penal code that the British left, it discriminates against Hindus. The mandirs, they're paying a tax. We are living as Hindus in Bharat under conditions of religious apartheid. State-sponsored religious apartheid is actually the description for the circumstances in which Hindus are living even today. We are seeing an unequal application of the law. All of these things have yet to be dealt with. And slowly and steadily, they are being dealt with. The one thing that we can do, and the one thing that's vital, is that the Hindu community needs to learn how to articulate consensus. It needs to be able to come together and say, we are the indigenous people of this land, right? Our history, the sacrifices of our ancestors are etched into the stone and into the soil, into the trees and the land itself. And we have a right for our voice to be the dominant voice in this country. And nobody else needs to fear, because they never have done. They have never needed to fear. And that's what we're asserting. I would say that until the genuine principles of democracy, which is the rule of law by the majority, democratically articulated, becomes the rule in Bharat, we still haven't achieved our freedom from enslavement on all levels. Slowly, we're reclawing part of our continent, the physical continent, but also the continent of knowledge, the continent of history, the continent of language, all of those that were colonized. We're slowly beginning to work our way through and reclaim what really belongs to the Bharatiya civilization. When we have complete equality and we have uniform civil code, all of the things that a democratic majority would create, and we have the establishment of not a democracy, but a dharmocracy, a Hindu Rashtra, then and only then will our decolonization and truly our independence from slavery be a reality.
I cannot count the number of times I've had chills while listening to that, Panditji, because
Thank you.
it. Please, please.
Yeah, it's an area that I have, being in Britain, being in a Hindu, living in the land which enslaved two-thirds of humanity and then told everyone that it was going to lead a commonwealth. You know, there are so many discordant accounts and records of history and understandings. So I've had to understand the reality of what happened and find a way to integrate it in my own understanding of who I am, where I am, and what we as Hindus, British Hindus, have to do. And so this is the tip of the iceberg. You have just had a glimpse under the carpet under which the atrocities that were inflicted upon us were brushed away by the British. And so this is the beginning of a process. I am very positive. I'm very very excited by the fact that we now have dharmic youngsters who are able to articulate in the language of the slavers what the crimes of the slavers are. That is such a powerful development. Um, I often chuckle because we who can do that, we are Macaulay's worst nightmare. He wanted people who looked like Indians but who were Pakka Gora, English inside. And what we are now seeing is the appearance of a generation who actually look as though they're English, and yet inside they are Sanatani to the core. And so this is Paramatma delivering what is necessary and not necessarily what was desired and schemed for. So great things to come. And the more we can share with our Sanatani family about who they really are, about what was deliberately done to them, how divide and rule worked, the closer we move to becoming truly independent. And then we will see Vishwaguru.
Absolutely. And with things and with initiatives like this, the day is actually coming closer.
It is. It is. One thing that's happening and is not noticed yet is that the Euro Christian populations are becoming more dharmic on a daily basis. They may not overtly say, oh, I'm Hindu or whatever, but they are embracing the ideas which are fundamentally Sanatani. You know, that we are not sinners by birth and all that rubbish, that Paramatma resides within each of us, that everyone is a divine soul, right? That there isn't an inadequacy that needs clerics to sell us the snake oil of salvation and, you know, future promises to heavens and all of this sort of stuff. The West is buying into these ideas. It's rejecting the enslaving ideologies more and more. So there is an upswell, a resurgence of dharmic acceptance, the understanding of the transmigration of a jivatma, the proliferation of yoga bhyas and yog vidya, the practicing of dhyan, dharana, samadhi, pranayam, all of these things. So the world outside of Bharat is moving closer to a global Vishwaguru, only they don't know it. They're ready to receive the instructions. They are becoming sadhaks who have got earned adhikar to receive dharmic instruction. And so that's a massive, massive development. What we need to do is to put our own house in order, dust ourselves down, and with confidence resume our place. We are the oldest civilization who understood why we're here and who serve where we are.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of initiatives, Panditji, our friend Minakshi Sharanji had talked to us about an initiative that she has taken up, especially to pay to pay due respects to the people that were affected due to the dismemberment, which is known as the Shrad Sankalp. So, what do you know about this initiative, Panditji? We'd love to know more about
It's a
this.
wonderful suggestion and a thought that we talk about this. So Minakshiji and I, we know each other. We've talked on a number of occasions. In fact, I was having a chat with her only yesterday about her initiative. This is now the third year, I think. And last year, Prime Minister Modi ji acknowledged the concept of the necessity for a Shrad Sankalpa. And so her idea and her understanding is that, and much of this is based on her family's personal experience. So her family in partition times, or we'll have to publicize a replacement word for that, but we'll think of it. We'll think of it. So her family at that time suffered the most horrific traumas. Members of her family had to kill their own friends, family, and relatives in order to avoid the desecration that was being rained down upon Hindu bodies who were imprisoned and enslaved. And so she carries that memory still within her, members of her own personal family. And she always felt that people were lost without any account. There were whole villages that were erased, and nobody knew who they were, purely and solely because they were Hindus. And all of those atmas, those jivatmas that died in trauma, our teaching is that that trauma persists even after dehant, after the end of the physical body. And what we do is we perform our Shrad ceremonies, we do tarpan and everything else, so that those jivatma can be guided to a place of tranquility, to reconcile the pain and the suffering that they carry with them, and to encourage them to continue along their journey. When you think of the amount of suffering that is stored up as a result of the horrors that were inflicted upon Hindus in 47, there is a necessity for a Shrad ceremony to be done. And the 15th of August, I think, is the right time to do this. In the same way that the Jewish community commemorate what was done to them when they fled Egypt, and they still carry that in their culture, they remember it every year. They remember the horrors that were rained upon them as part of the World War II genocide by the Germans. We haven't yet had the confidence to be able to embrace some of the more painful parts of our own history. And so Meenakshiji's initiative is something I would recommend everybody to research and to participate in. On the 15th of August, execute a sankalpa, hold the memory of those who were lost to us under the most tragic of circumstances, alone, um, physically, uh, they were they had such violence inflicted upon their bodies, they died in such traumatic circumstances. If you hold a memory of them and an appreciation for their sacrifice in our own hearts and thoughts, if we hold that bhavna on the 15th of August and then undertake the sankalpa to remember them and to wish them an onward journey an auspicious onward journey, it will be a wonderful, wonderful act, and it will cause such a release of suffering. Everybody who does this, who brings that pain into their heart, into their own heart, and then puts out a sense of forgiveness, a sense of appreciation, a sense of acknowledgement. You know, it's almost like with our heart, we launder the hate and we cleanse that energy and put it back into the system. And then the system starts to thrive and prosper. We will see such a release of positive energy from doing this. And so I would really encourage everybody to also do join Minakshiji, do the Shrad Sankalpa on the 15th of August. And she's, I believe this year she's conducting it. She normally does it at Haridwar. She's doing it this year as well, but I think she's also doing it on Clubhouse and other platforms. So it's easy to participate. But even if you can't participate, find a Pandit somewhere. It doesn't have to be a big affair. Make the Sankalpa, cultivate the bhavna, and then release the Sankalpa.
Absolutely. I think this would be the most meaningful way to celebrate, not celebrate, but to remember.
Yes, it's necessary.
It's absolutely necessary. Good way to pay the respects of the lives that we lost during that day.
It's so important, especially when you recognize the transmigration of Jivatmas. But one of the other things it does is it helps us to embrace the horrors that have been inflicted upon us and which are still responsible for where we are today. And when we can embrace them and understand them, when we can address them and face them, then we can move beyond them. And at the moment, just the thought of what was done to us, we recoil in horror. We need to get to the stage where we know what was done to us, we can speak about it, and everybody knows about it, so that we can make sure it is never repeated. And that's part of the journey of this Shrad Sankalpa. And so thank you for bringing that up and reminding me of this. It's a very necessary thing for everyone to incorporate into the celebrations that we undertake on 15th of August, but also let's make it a commemoration as well.
Absolutely. And thank you for your insights, for your
Um,
suggestions, because it's the need of the hour. It's not even talked about. No one knows. Sadly, our own people, we do not know about it. And it is absolutely the need of the hour.
well, this is where Festival of Bharat and other stations, Chitti Media, etc., are doing such brilliant work. We are reconnecting with who we are. We are connecting with our family members all over the world. We are actually beginning to understand our place in the history of humanity. We're beginning to appreciate the contributions of our ancestors, the sacrifices of those who have gone before us. We are survivors, and we still have a civilization which is largely intact, and we can rebuild it. We are the last surviving indigenous, living, breathing civilization. And what a wonderful, wonderful legacy we carry. Why not develop it, and why not bring a renaissance to it?
Rightly said.
Thank you, Vaibhaviji. Thank you.
Thank you,
Jai
Panditji,
Shri
for
Ram.
joining us today and for your insights. We
My honor.
hope we hope our viewers take away this message, especially today on the Independence Day, so that they, in their own way, are able to contribute towards taking this nation to its actual independence in its realest form, in the truest sense.
The world needs us to be independent. Every jiva needs us to recover our understanding of who we are and what our role is.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Chitti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.